Alvin and Verena Calder had learned, slowly and stubbornly, how to make small comforts stretch. Thrift was less habit than an old promise kept to each other. They had lived most of their lives within a few square miles of Ashford Heights, a tidy town that taught quiet pride like a daily ritual. At 73 and 70, they moved with careful deliberation. Alvin's hands remembered the weight of sheet metal and nails from a life in maintenance. Verena's eyes still noticed the exact blue of a bargain coat on a rack. Recently, something had taken more than a bargain from them. A smooth-talking investment man had folded up their rainy day nest into a neat lie. $20,000, gone. The loss did not break them, but it bent every plan toward caution. It left them with an emptier mailbox and a little less sleep. The auction at Ashford Storage felt, at first, like a place where other people's ghosts met useful hands. Alvin had worked part-time at a supply store years ago, the kind that sold thick-walled plastic containers to people who wanted things kept tidy and private. He remembered the way certain customers from Ashford's wealthier enclaves bought those containers in bundles, carefully, almost ceremonially. That memory was small and exact, an inventory of shapes and lids, and it nudged him more surely than a plan. When Verena mentioned a notice for an unpaid unit in a district where marble mailboxes outnumbered maples, Alvin listened. They had little to spend, but the idea of one cautious gamble, spent not on hope laundering but on a possibility, felt like something they could allow themselves. It was, in Alvin's words, a quiet rebellion against the notion that they were done with surprises. They arrived early on a damp Tuesday, the storage yard smelling of metal and cold concrete. People clustered like weathered flags, resellers with headlamps, a family picking through a unit as if reading someone else's life, a man with a clipboard who moved with the steady patience of a professional scavenger. When Unit 52 rolled up, the sight, barn quiet, not ostentatious, made Alvin's chest tighten. Inside, stacked and sealed, lay something unexpected. One enormous wooden crate, its boards roughly hewn and banded, almost the size of the unit itself. Around it, smaller duffels, a couple of plastic bins, and a case that caught the pale light like a buried promise. They did the sensible thing and bid without fanfare. Their offer was not a declaration but a careful lift. When the gavel fell and the unit became theirs, it felt heavier than a paper tag. Verena pressed her palm to the cold metal of the door as if steadying the moment itself. They took the key home in the car with the same quiet reverence they'd given to church programs and family keepsakes. The crate, more tomb than box, sat like a question waiting on their living room floor when they returned, wood grain, nails, and the faint smell of something cedar-like under the dust. They did not open it at once. It was late. They were tired. Hope, they agreed, deserved daylight. The following morning, sunlight cut through kitchen curtains and turned the crate a golden rawness. Alvin fetched a crowbar and worked with patient, practiced hands. Verena cleared a space and kept count of every scrap and nail as though each had witness value. When at last a plank came free, it revealed stacked layers. Duffel bags, a weathered baseball glove, a bundle of magazines tied with twine, and beneath them, in a shallow cavity, a small wooden box that clattered like a modest trove. They had expected junk and were surprised to find order. On top of one duffel lay a small pile of cards, the glossy faces of baseball players from the 1990s, their corners sharp and stickers intact. Alvin lifted them with the careful fingers of a man who belonged to the world of parts and paper, and the sight warmed him in a way money had not done in months. They packed the most portable things, the cards, the small wooden box, and a weatherproof case that felt, to Alvin's thumb, like metal and purpose. They left the rest, boxes tied tight, a heavy canvas roll that resisted casual inspection, for another day. Their plan was modest and practical. Take a few things to the pawn shop, see what the cards might bring, and keep the rest safe while they thought. The pawn shop on Maple had seen them before. Its owner knew how tight money could get and how much dignity mattered in a hurry. Verena folded a card under her cheek, smiling in a private way. For once they left the house feeling like people who had not only survived but made a choice that might change the month. At the pawn shop the cards drew a polite interest that surprised them both. The clerk handled them with respect, named a number, and then another number after a careful look. It was not wealth and it was not ruin. It was a small, steady lifeline. When they accepted, Alvin tucked the bills into his pocket as if the cash might temper itself. "We'll bring the rest later," he told Verena, and she nodded. They both knew the crate still sat in their living room like a heavy breath. Before leaving, Alvin remembered the metal case he had slid into his jacket, something that had felt substantial in the crate and odd to ignore. In the car, on a quiet stretch of road, he unlatched it. Inside lay a modern smartphone, dark and cool as river glass. It was ordinary at first glance. No decorative case, no stickered back. Alvin turned it over, thumb brushing a fingerprint-smeared screen. He hesitated. It might be locked. It might be dead. He could not say why, but the sight of it plucked at him differently than cards or boxes. It felt the sort of thing that connected lives. They drove home with the modest proceeds from the pawnshop safe, their step a little lighter but cautious. The crate waited. The canvas roll retained its secret. Alvin placed the phone gently on the kitchen table as if it were an animal he did not wish to scare. They agreed to leave it unpowered for the night, to avoid the flurry of what-ifs. For the first time since the loss that had narrowed their days, Verena laughed at nothing more than the way sunlight fell across the living room floor. They had a little money in hand and something worth looking into. It was not salvation, but it felt like a useful start. That evening, after supper and the small rituals of bedtime, Alvin carried the phone to the window to charge it quietly on a spare plug. He told himself it was simply to see whether it turned on. Curiosity, nothing braver. The screen blinked, then pulsed with life. Notifications spilled in a tidy stream. A name registered on the top of the screen. A single message preview that read, "Help me find it." Location ping enabled. Alvin's hands went suddenly cold. In the street beyond the curtains, a car headlights passed deliberately slow, and somewhere very near the soft throb of an engine that did not belong to a neighbor coughed and settled. They had bought a box. They had expected trinkets and maybe a small payday. Instead, the small device on their table had just told them that someone, somewhere, was still looking. Before Alvin could decide whether to close the screen, a distant siren threaded through the evening air, far off and then oddly close, and a shadow moved beneath their window like a question. If you want to follow how one simple choice turns into something far riskier, take a moment to like and subscribe. This is only the beginning. By morning, the sound of the night had rearranged itself into silence, but not the kind that soothed. It was the silence of something watching, waiting to be remembered. The phone still sat on the kitchen table, black screen blank again, looking harmless and ordinary. Alvin stared at it over his coffee, his hands steady in that practiced way of people who had learned to control their fear. Verena moved quietly around the kitchen, avoiding the table as if the phone might hear her. Neither spoke of what they'd seen, the faint glow, the words on the screen, the slow hum of an idling car beyond the window. They had grown old on practicality. Fear, for them, came second to what must be done. The plan, at least, was simple: go back to the storage unit, finish clearing it out before the 2-day access limit ended. They had paid fair and square for it, and the clock was ticking. Alvin slipped the phone into an empty biscuit tin, a habit from old war films, something about blocking signals, though he didn't know if it worked, and set it in the glove compartment before they drove off. Verena sat beside him, hands folded, her eyes watching the morning roll past like an answer she wasn't sure she wanted. The storage facility was busier than before. The lot buzzed with the rhythm of heavy doors rolling up, muffled music from someone's truck radio, the shouts of buyers calling for dollies and carts. The air smelled of dust and oil and something faintly chemical. Unit 52 waited at the far end, its padlock shining dull under the gray light. As Alvin slid the door upward, the scent of aged wood and old paper drifted out. The crate was half disassembled now, and what remained looked like the ribs of some wooden beast, hollowed and waiting. They worked slowly, methodically. Alvin cleared smaller boxes while Verena catalogued what she could see. Tin containers, a sealed canvas duffel that was heavier than it should have been, 2 long narrow cases that made her uneasy before she even touched them. Inside one was a hunting rifle, well-oiled, clean, a cloth still wrapped neatly around its stock. The other held 2 pistols, both modern, both loaded. Verena stepped back, pressing a hand to her chest. "These shouldn't be here," she said quietly, voice shaking in that thin, controlled way of disbelief. Alvin crouched, studying the weapons like evidence in a story that wasn't theirs. He had seen guns before, years ago in the army, and he knew the difference between display pieces and tools meant to be used. These were the latter. The duffel bag beneath them held cash, neat bundles of hundreds, wrapped in bank paper that had yellowed with time. He lifted one stack and counted almost by reflex. 2,000. Another bundle, then another. The total, when Verena joined in, was over $20,000. For a long moment neither spoke. The wind outside rattled a loose sheet of metal somewhere down the row. Alvin's heart felt strange, not racing but aware. "We need to think," he said, and she nodded, her eyes bright with something between fear and wonder. They decided to take only a few items home at first. The duffel with the cash, the small case with the phone, still sealed in its biscuit tin, and the wooden box of cards. The guns, Alvin locked back inside the unit for the night. His reasoning was simple. They didn't need trouble, and weapons were always trouble. Driving home, the weight of the duffel in the back seat felt both miraculous and dangerous. Verena kept glancing at it, half expecting it to vanish. "What if it's dirty money?" she asked finally. Alvin didn't answer at once. "Then it's already been washed by time," he said softly. "And time's a better cleaner than we'll ever be." They stopped by the same pawn shop from the day before. This time, the owner's smile tightened when he saw the duffel. He was a man used to small trades, not bundles of old bills. Alvin, careful as always, explained they had found some collectibles, didn't mention the guns or the storage auction. The owner agreed to test a few notes. "Old paper," he said. "Legit. You could probably take this to the bank, but they'll ask questions." On their way back to the car, Verena felt a flicker of warmth. Not joy, not yet, but the shape of it. They could finally fix the roof. Maybe visit their daughter in Oregon. She imagined grocery bags without coupons and nights without counting every light bulb. Back at home, Alvin finally gave into curiosity. He took the biscuit tin from the car and, after a long hesitation, powered on the phone again. The screen blinked alive, but this time there was no message, only a small red dot pulsing on a map app. He tapped it by accident, and the screen zoomed in on their street. A second later, a faint ping sounded from somewhere close outside. A car door, maybe. Then another sound, a knock. He froze. 3 short taps, polite but deliberate, echoed through the small house. Verena looked up from the kitchen. "Delivery?" she asked. He shook his head. They hadn't ordered anything. When he peered through the curtain, his chest tightened. A police cruiser sat at the curb, lights off, 2 officers stepping out. What followed felt almost unreal. The officers were polite, calm, their presence official but oddly expectant. They asked whether Alvin and Verena Calder had recently purchased a storage unit at Ashford Storage. Alvin said yes, cautiously. The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then asked to come inside. Verena's instinct screamed no, but Alvin, ever the rule follower, stepped aside. The lead officer gestured toward the table, to the phone lying screen up. "We've been tracking that device," he said evenly. "It's linked to an ongoing investigation. We believe the previous owner may have been involved in narcotics distribution." The words fell like cold water. Alvin tried to explain, haltingly, how they'd bought the unit legally. The officer nodded. "That's exactly why we're here. You didn't do anything wrong. But we'll need to see what came with it." They returned to the storage facility together. The officer's car followed them all the way, lights still off. Inside the unit, they moved with quiet efficiency, photographing everything. The weapons, the boxes, the canvas roll that turned out to contain small packets of white powder, sealed and labeled. Alvin's throat tightened when he saw it. He had worked too long, lived too straight, to ever imagine drugs inside something he owned. The officers conferred briefly, radioed something, and then turned back to the couple. "You'll need to come down to the station tomorrow for a statement," one said, his tone less accusatory than procedural. "As for this money, it will have to be verified. If it's clean, it's yours. The law's clear on that." Verena's knees went weak with relief, but also disbelief. Could it really be that simple? The younger officer, perhaps noticing, offered a small nod. "You'd be surprised how often this happens," he said. "Criminals stash things they never come back for. You folks might have just bought yourselves some justice." By the time they drove home, night had fallen again. The air felt sharper, thinner, as though the world had leaned closer. The phone was gone now, taken as evidence, and the house was quiet except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. Verena sat at the table, hands clasped, the image of the duffel still burned behind her eyes. For years they had lived on the edge of scarcity, losing slowly, carefully, with dignity. And now, through a door they'd bought on a whim, something had turned in their favor. It didn't feel like luck, it felt like balance. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and deliberate. Alvin looked through the window and thought about how sometimes fate didn't knock. It left things in locked boxes, waiting for someone stubborn enough to pry them open. If you're still following this unbelievable true story, make sure to like and subscribe, because what happens when they return to the police station will surprise even them. The next morning arrived slow and gray, the kind of morning that felt undecided about light. Alvin stood at the kitchen window, holding his coffee long after it had gone cold, watching a curtain of drizzle soften the world outside. It had been years since he'd felt the kind of nervousness that made his hands tremble, not since the day he'd signed away his pension to a man who promised impossible returns. Verena, dressed neatly in her Sunday coat though it was only Thursday, moved through the house as if each step needed to be deliberate. They both understood what today meant. It was not just about explaining themselves to the police, it was about whether fate had handed them a gift or a curse disguised as one. The police station sat in the center of Ashford Heights, a plain red brick building with the unremarkable scent of disinfectant and wet coats. Inside, the hum of printers and ringing phones blended into a quiet kind of tension. They were greeted by a young officer who led them into a small interview room that felt more like a doctor's office than a place for questions. The walls were bare except for a clock that ticked too loudly, as though measuring their composure. The same two officers from the night before entered after a few minutes. Their faces were calm, professional, but the air between them carried the weight of something still unfolding. The older one introduced himself again, Lieutenant Drayton, and thanked the Calders for their cooperation. He asked them to recount everything from the first moment they saw the storage auction notice to the moment the officers arrived at their door. Alvin spoke carefully, his tone even, his story as simple and uncolored as truth allowed. He described the unit, the crate, the duffel, and the phone, making sure not to dramatize what didn't need drama. Verena filled in details he missed, how long they'd been there, what the other boxes looked like, how many bundles of cash there had been. When they finished, Drayton nodded slowly and folded his hands. "You did everything by the book," he said. "There's no issue with the purchase. You won the auction legally, and ownership transfers automatically. The problem isn't with you, it's with who rented that unit before you." His partner opened a thin folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a grainy photograph of a man in his 30s, sharp-eyed, unsmiling. "Name's Tyler Reddick," the officer said. "He's been wanted for a while. Drugs, weapons, money laundering. We believe your unit was one of several he used to stash things in before he disappeared 2 years ago." Verena stared at the photo for a long time. The face meant nothing to her, but the thought that his life had bled into theirs made her stomach tighten. "So, the money?" she asked quietly. Drayton leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We'll have it examined," he said. "If it isn't marked and doesn't connect directly to any pending case, it's legally yours. We can't confiscate what was abandoned and sold under court authority. That's the law." The words landed gently, but their meaning hit hard. Alvin felt the tremor in his chest subside, replaced by something warmer, relief, maybe, or disbelief trying on the shape of hope. He had spent most of his life losing small battles, and for once, it seemed he'd won one without cheating. The officers took statements for nearly an hour, asked their final questions, and escorted them out with polite nods. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight seeped through the clouds, washing the wet streets in dull silver. Verena exhaled, the first true breath she'd taken all morning. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Alvin hesitated, then shook his head. Things like this, they echo for a while. They stopped by a small diner before heading home. The waitress, a woman with sharp eyes softened by kindness, brought them coffee and pie without asking. For a while, they sat in near silence, the comfort of clinking cups and low chatter pressing against their nerves like a warm blanket. Verena traced the rim of her mug, her thoughts miles away. "You know," she said, "it's strange. We spent years waiting for a break, and when it finally came, it wore the wrong face." Alvin smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knew too much about disappointment. "Maybe luck doesn't dress up nice," he said. "Maybe it just shows up looking like work." When they returned home that afternoon, the neighborhood felt different, too quiet, too watchful. Their house sat at the end of a narrow lane where every sound lingered, and today those sounds felt sharper. Alvin checked the lock twice, then 3 times. On the kitchen table lay the paperwork from the auction, the only proof that what they'd done was legal. He folded it carefully, slipped it into a drawer, and sat down beside Verena. They didn't turn on the television or the radio. They just listened to the quiet, the way people do when they've learned that peace is fragile. Later that evening, as the sun slid low behind the houses, a knock came at the door. It wasn't harsh, but it carried the rhythm of authority. Verena stiffened. Alvin opened it to find a courier standing on the porch, raincoat slick with drizzle. The man held a sealed envelope and a clipboard. "Delivery for Mr. Calder," he said, handing it over. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no letterhead, no signature, just a typed message that read, "If you want to keep what's yours, don't trust everyone who smiles." The words had weight heavier than any threat could have. Alvin read them twice, then 3 times, feeling the air grow colder with each line. He handed the paper to Verena, who paled as she read. "Do you think it's him? That man they're looking for?" she whispered. Alvin shook his head slowly. "He's gone, or they'd have found him. But maybe someone else isn't." The evening turned restless. Every sound outside made them look up. A passing car's headlights brushed across their curtains like silent warnings. Alvin locked the door again, his movements steady but urgent. He wasn't a man easily rattled, yet this was something different. It wasn't fear of the law or guilt. It was the sudden understanding that they had stepped into a story that hadn't finished telling itself. When Verena finally went to bed, Alvin stayed up, sitting in the dark with the envelope on the table and the low hum of the refrigerator keeping him company. He thought about the man in the photograph, the guns, the phone, the way the police had known exactly where to find them. Somewhere, in the quiet pulse of the night, he realized that stories like this didn't stop at the signing of a statement. They kept moving just out of sight. As the clock struck midnight, Alvin whispered to himself, "If luck has a price, I'd better hope I can afford it." And if you believe every mystery has another door waiting behind it, hit like and subscribe, because the one they open next might not close so easily. By the time morning light broke through the curtains, Alvin was still awake. The note from the night before lay open on the table, edges curled slightly from the damp of his hands. He'd read it so many times the words no longer looked like words, just shapes carved into paper by someone who knew how to make fear without using the word itself. Verena joined him at the table, her hair still flattened from sleep, her face soft with exhaustion. She poured coffee and didn't ask if he'd slept. She already knew the answer. They ate breakfast in silence, the kind that carries more questions than words ever could. The envelope sat between them like a guest neither had invited. Eventually, Alvin folded it and slipped it into the same drawer where the auction papers rested. "If someone wanted us scared," he said quietly, "they've done their job." Verena looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Then we can't let them see it worked." The plan that morning was simple: go back to the storage unit one last time. The police had said they'd cleared everything for evidence, but there were still boxes they hadn't finished sorting: personal items, magazines, old papers. Alvin wanted closure, something physical to mark the end of the ordeal. He told himself it was just cleanup, but deep down he knew it was also to make sure no one else had tampered with what was theirs. The drive felt longer than usual. The air had that heavy stillness that comes before a storm, and the world seemed to move a little too slowly. When they reached Ashford's storage, the manager, A thin man with tired eyes and a permanent look of suspicion met them at the gate. "Unit 52's been released back to you," he said, flipping through his clipboard. "Police finished last night. You've got 48 hours to clear it." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "You two must have bought something real interesting. We had plainclothes cops here half the night." Alvin offered a polite nod, hiding the unease crawling up his spine. He parked near the back and rolled up the metal door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold steel. Everything had been disturbed, boxes opened, contents neatly repacked, yellow evidence tags still dangling from corners. The crate was gone. The space felt smaller now, hollow. Verena stood at the entrance, reluctant to step in, her breath misting in the cool air. They began sorting what was left. Most of it was ordinary. A few books, a rusted lamp, empty picture frames, and stacks of cheap winter coats. But near the back, half hidden beneath a tarp, Alvin found something that made him pause. A small metal lockbox no bigger than a lunch pail. It wasn't tagged, which meant the police hadn't seen it. He brushed away the dust, felt the cold bite of steel under his fingertips, and realized it was still locked. "Maybe leave it," Verena said softly. Alvin shook his head. "They didn't mark it. Means it's not evidence. It's ours to find." He slipped it into a tote bag, his movements steady but cautious. As they carried the last of the boxes out to the car, a gray sedan slowed at the far end of the lot. It didn't stop, just lingered long enough for Alvin to notice the faint reflection of a face behind the tinted glass. Then it rolled away. He told himself it was coincidence. Still, he double-checked the lock on the unit before driving off. At home, the air felt strangely still. Verena started unpacking boxes, stacking books by the wall and laying folded coats across the couch. Alvin sat at the kitchen table with the lockbox. It had no key, only a narrow slot where a latch might have been. He fetched a screwdriver and began working at the edge until, with a metallic click, the lid gave way. Inside lay several sealed envelopes wrapped in plastic and a small spiral notebook. The first envelope contained cash, smaller bills this time, carefully counted and bundled. The second held something stranger, black and white photographs of storage units, all with numbers scrawled in red marker. Some were circled, others crossed out. The notebook listed dates, amounts, and initials, not names, just fragments of a ledger written in tidy, deliberate handwriting. Alvin flipped through page after page, feeling the shape of something large and dangerous taking form. This wasn't one man's stash, it was part of a network. Verena joined him, her face pale as she looked at the photos. "Do you think this is what they were looking for?" she asked. Alvin nodded slowly. "And they think we still have it." They sat in silence, the weight of understanding pressing against the walls of the small kitchen. Somewhere beyond their window, a car passed, too slow again, too curious. Alvin exhaled through his nose. "We need to make a choice," he said finally. "Either we take this to the police now, or we disappear quietly before someone decides to come looking." But before they could decide, the phone rang. The sound startled them both. No one called at that hour. Alvin picked it up cautiously. A man's voice, calm but deliberate, spoke on the other end. "Mr. Calder," it said, "you found something that doesn't belong to you." There was no threat in his tone, no anger, only a steady certainty that chilled more than shouting ever could. "You're a reasonable man. Let's stay that way. Bring the box to the old truck stop outside town tonight. Leave it by the vending machines. Walk away. No one needs to get hurt." Before Alvin could reply, the line went dead. The sound of the dial tone filled the kitchen, long and hollow. Verena's hand found his arm. "We can't go," she whispered. "It could be a trap." Alvin stared at the lockbox, the notebook still open beside it, and thought of the $20,000 they'd found, the guns, the message on the phone. Everything connected now, each piece a thread leading back to something they had never meant to touch. For hours they argued softly, about right and wrong, safety and risk, trust and fear. Verena wanted to call Lieutenant Drayton. Alvin hesitated. The note had warned them not to trust everyone who smiled, and though he wanted to believe in the officers, the careful way the investigation had ended still gnawed at him. What if the wrong people were already listening? As dusk fell, he made his decision. He wrapped the lockbox in brown paper, tied it with twine, and tucked it beneath the seat of their old sedan. Verena watched from the doorway, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "Please, Alvin," she said quietly, "don't do this alone." He met her gaze, his voice steady but soft. "I'll just drop it and drive. If it keeps us safe, it's worth the risk." The road to the truck stop was nearly empty. The air smelled of wet asphalt and pine, the horizon bleeding orange and violet as the sun dipped below the hills. When he pulled into the cracked lot, the world felt too quiet, like a film with the sound turned down. He parked near the vending machines, engine running, lights off. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a figure stepped out from behind the building, tall, coat drawn tight, face obscured by the shadow of a cap. The man didn't approach, he just waited, watching. Alvin placed the wrapped box beside the vending machine, his movements deliberate, visible. When he straightened up again, the man nodded once, a small, almost respectful gesture, and disappeared into the darkness. Alvin returned to the car, his hands shaking for the first time all night. He drove home without looking back, every shadow on the road a question he didn't want answered. When he reached the house, Verena met him at the door, tears already in her eyes. "It's done," he whispered, and she nodded. But just as he locked the door behind them, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't the same voice. It was Lieutenant Drayton. "Mr. Calder," he said, his tone sharper than before, "we need to talk. The evidence from your unit, it's missing. Someone cleared out the holding room last night. Do you still have that box?" Alvin froze, every muscle tightening. He met Verena's eyes, and for a long, breathless moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "No, Lieutenant. Not anymore." Drayton's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then you'd better make sure whoever does won't come looking for you." The line went dead again. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping dry leaves across the porch. Alvin stood still for a long time, feeling the world tilt just slightly under his feet. He had done what he thought was right, but rightness suddenly felt fragile, like the thin glass between light and dark. And as he turned off the porch light that night, one thought echoed louder than the wind. Sometimes, even when you close the door on trouble, it knows how to find its way back. If you think this story has reached its end, think again. Because in the final part, the past they tried to bury will finally come knocking. The sun rose pale and heavy that morning, struggling to break through the clouds that hung low over Ashford Heights. The Calder's house, small and neat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, felt like a ship trapped in fog. Inside, the air was thick with that kind of silence that makes every small sound, every tick of the wall clock, every creak of the wooden floor, seem too loud, too meaningful. Alvin sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, staring at the folded note that had arrived days earlier. The message still echoed in his head like a ghost that refused to leave. "If you want to keep what's yours, don't trust everyone who smiles." For a man who had spent his entire life believing that doing the right thing would always lead to safety, it was a truth he had never wanted to learn. Verena stood by the sink, her movements slow and careful as she washed the same cup for the third time. She had barely spoken since the night Alvin had delivered the lockbox. The relief she had felt then had turned into something more complicated, doubt mixed with fear. She wanted to believe that returning the box had closed the door on everything that had followed, that life could simply settle back into its quiet rhythm of small routines and predictable comfort. But every shadow outside the window made her pause, and every passing car made her heart tighten. "Maybe we should leave for a while," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just pack up and go somewhere. The coast, maybe. Start fresh." Alvin looked up from his thoughts. The idea was tempting, but he knew better than to think geography could outrun consequence. "If we leave," he said, "they'll take it as fear. And if they think we're afraid, they'll follow us wherever we go." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "No. We stay put. We act like people with nothing to hide." The words sounded strong, but inside he felt anything but steady. Every instinct told him the game wasn't over. He had lived too long, seen too many people lose too much, to mistake quiet for safety. And sure enough, By late afternoon, that uneasy quiet shattered. A sharp knock broke through the air, 3 hard raps against the door, followed by another. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a neighbor or the firm rhythm of a delivery. It was urgent, measured. Alvin's body tensed immediately. He opened the door to find Lieutenant Drayton standing on the porch, rain dripping from the brim of his coat, his expression grave. 2 uniformed officers stood just behind him. The look in Drayton's eyes told Alvin everything before a single word was spoken. The story was far from finished. "Mr. Calder," Drayton said, his voice low and deliberate, "we need to talk inside. Please." Verina's hands trembled slightly as she stepped back to let them in. The living room, with its soft lighting and faded curtains, suddenly felt too small to hold the weight that entered with them. Drayton removed his cap and glanced around, as if checking for listening ears, then lowered his voice. "You were right not to trust everyone," he said. "The evidence we collected from your storage unit, the crate, the duffel, even the digital records, they're gone. Someone accessed the evidence room last night. No forced entry, no security alert. Whoever it was had clearance." Alvin felt his chest tighten. "You're saying it was one of your own?" Drayton didn't answer directly. Instead, he took a small envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the table. Inside was a flash drive sealed in clear plastic. "We found this in the facility's security system backup," he said. "It was hidden deep in the camera archives. Someone tried to delete it, but our tech pulled it before it disappeared. It shows the man who took the box from you at the truck stop. We ran facial recognition." He hesitated before finishing. "He used to be a federal agent. Disappeared 6 years ago. Real name's Marcus Hale. He worked on organized crime cases, specifically drug routes tied to Tyler Reddick." The name sent a chill through the room. The circle had closed. Reddick's money, his weapons, his network, they had all been fragments of something much larger. And the Calders, by chance or by fate, had stepped into the very center of it. Verina sank slowly into a chair, her eyes fixed on the envelope. "So what does this mean for us?" she asked quietly. Drayton leaned forward, his expression softening. "It means you're not the target anymore. You were collateral, people caught in the crossfire of something that's been simmering for years. But it also means you might be the last loose thread. Whoever's cleaning this up wants silence, and that makes you a problem." The words hung in the air like smoke. Alvin's hand clenched against the edge of the table. "Then what are you going to do about it?" Drayton met his gaze. "We're moving you under temporary protection. Somewhere quiet, off the grid. We'll handle the rest. You've done your part." At first, Alvin wanted to refuse. He had spent his entire life standing his ground, even when that ground crumbled beneath him. But as he looked at Verina, the deep worry lines beneath her eyes, the way her hands gripped the chair like an anchor, he knew this wasn't about pride. It was about survival. "All right," he said finally. "But I want to know one thing. What was really in that box?" Drayton hesitated, then gave a faint, weary smile. "Enough to buy a lifetime of silence," he said. "And maybe enough to ruin the people who tried to keep it hidden. Let's just say you did the world a favor." That night, the Calders packed what little they needed. Clothes, photographs, the essentials of a life that could fit into 2 small suitcases. They left their home quietly, escorted by unmarked cars through winding back roads until the lights of Ashford Heights disappeared behind them. They didn't speak much during the drive. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes, endings don't come with clarity or victory. They come with a fragile kind of peace, the kind that asks for nothing more than to simply keep breathing. Weeks passed. The world moved on as it always does. News outlets ran short stories about corruption in evidence handling, about missing funds tied to an old criminal investigation, but no names were mentioned. The Calders settled into a small coastal town under new names, where the mornings smelled of salt and the nights came quietly. They rented a cottage overlooking the water and spent their days tending to a small garden, cooking simple meals, and learning what silence could feel like when it wasn't a warning. One evening, as the sun set across the sea, Alvin stood by the window watching the horizon burn gold. Verina joined him, holding 2 cups of tea, her voice gentle but steady. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. The storage unit? The money? All of it? He smiled faintly. Every day, he said. But not the way you'd think. I don't wonder what we lost. I think about what we managed to keep. She looked at him curiously. And what's that? He turned to her, his gaze soft but clear. Ourselves, he said. Our luck didn't make us rich, it made us careful. It reminded us that some doors are meant to stay closed. They stood there together in the fading light, the sound of waves breaking softly against the shore. The world outside their window felt vast and forgiving again, no longer the maze of secrets it had been. And though they would never fully understand why fate had chosen them to stumble into someone else's buried world, they knew one thing for certain: sometimes survival itself is the greatest fortune a person can find. As the last trace of sunlight vanished into the sea, Alvin whispered, more to himself than to her, maybe luck's just another word for getting one more chance to live right. And for everyone who believes that even the smallest choices can rewrite an entire life, remember to stay curious, stay kind, and never underestimate the stories that wait behind locked doors. Because sometimes, the most unexpected discoveries don't just change what you find, they change who you become.